So up next is Lori McClung, and Lori is the Chief Executive Officer of Advocacy and Communication Solutions, an award-winning national communication advocacy and strategy development consulting firm that helps nonprofits, governments, and philanthropic organizations position themselves as leaders either through advocacy, strategic development, communication, and capacity building. ACS currently works in 20 states. Lori has nearly 25 years of experience in media, public policy, and advocacy work. She and ACS have successfully advocated on various education, health, and human services and economic issues at the federal, state, and local levels. Before starting ACS in 2004, Lori held leadership positions with the Federation for Community Planning, Public and Private Ventures, the Cleveland Metropolitan School District, and the Center for Community Solutions. And so Lori is going to talk about how do you engage with lawmakers face to face, and what are the different ways, strategies, and tactics we can engage lawmakers outside of the social media sphere. So I will turn it over to Lori.
Thank you and good morning. I'm going to share my screen so to make sure you can see it. All right. Thumbs up, you can see my screen. All right.
We can.
All right. So good morning. Thank you very much for having me here. I want to start with a disclaimer that usually when we talk about these topics, these are 3-day trainings, 4-day trainings, several weeks trainings. So I am going to speed through many things, but please know there are a ton of resources that you can get from either our website or other people's websites, and we can talk about that in terms of other resources. This is just high level to give you a taste of what you can do, how you can do it. So in fact, we actually put out a book this past year that gives you lots of case studies and examples. So feel free to check that out. Again, there are lots of resources from lots of other folks as well. So today, I'm really going to try to very briefly talk about the importance of advocacy, what you can do, and all the tools at your disposal, even in a time of COVID, as well as how do you get more comfortable with engaging legislators. And some of this, my mom used to say this all the time, common sense, it's common sense, but common sense is not always that common. So I know some of it may seem super basic, but for me, it's always a reminder of what you can do and how you can do it. And you can. So why should you spend your time on advocacy? We know that many of you, most of you, are actually directly in the public health field, so busy every day, all day, and we absolutely appreciate and value that. That said, we know that health is a public interest, and things that are in public interest absolutely need to have advocacy, because many legislators, everybody wants to be healthy. Staffers want to be healthy, and they have an opinion about how to make that happen. But that doesn't mean that they have the background knowledge and the expertise to make the right decision. And that's where you all come in. And as you heard Jamie talk about, it's not just the work that you're doing, it's also how do you actually get others and stakeholders and partners to work together. When it's just us in our silos, whether it's our specific issue area within public health, or if it's just our advocacy efforts, we need to have other people up as a part of our advocacy efforts to actually turn up the volume and make sure that your message actually sticks. So just very briefly, I always find it helpful to start with some really good definitions. And what am I talking about when I talk about advocacy? And what am I talking about when I talk about lobbying? So advocacy is pretty much almost every single thing that you do from a education component. So this is like the big picture piece. And it's all the things that you're probably already engaged. In fact, I'm sure you're already engaged in. Where lobbying is really that specific focus on asking someone to vote yes or no on a piece of legislation. That's really the main distinction. So that's the big picture. The more specific examples are, again, it's asking for that vote on a specific piece of legislation, all of the general things that you do. So that can be, and actually we'll have a list of things in just a little bit around what are your pro education, pro policy, pro public health, pro um, research that you might share, that's advocacy. And then letting folks know what the ramifications are, that's your informing. These are all fine to do, and you should. And in fact, it's your right and it's your responsibility. And I will say, and I talk about this quite a bit as well, people make up a story in a vacuum. If they don't have the information, they'll come up with their own answers to the questions. Wouldn't you rather it be your story and your message that's in their head? So these are examples of the kinds of things that you can do. Again, you're probably doing many of these things already, but we want to just remind you that these are tools that are at your disposal. Some in the time of COVID, some of course not. And your work in the vaccination world has never been more important. Your work is more critical now than it has ever been before. We have a huge task ahead of us as a country, as a world, as it relates to vaccination. So your engagement in advocacy and your engagement in lobbying is just absolutely beyond necessary. So how do you actually engage policymakers? There's a lot of tips and tricks, and we'll go through a few of them, and hopefully in discussion we can go through more. I could probably tell you stories, lots. In fact, I know I could tell you lots of stories that would both make you laugh or make you scream. But we're going to go ahead and just give a few tips of what are the best ways to engage policymakers. So I'm really going to start with the what, then move to the who, and then move to the how. So in the what, the key is to know what is your goal? Is it to change something? Is it to keep it the same? Is it just to let people know what's going on? Depending on what your goal is, that's what's going to actually affect your message, your messengers, and pretty much every decision you make from that goal. So it could be positive immunization legislation. I think the key that we have to always remember when we talk about our goal and then subsequently our message is the message is not about you. It's about the audience. What do they need to hear and what do they need to know in order to make the decisions that you want them to make? And I'm not going to go into detail in this slide. This is like a 2 hours of a slide because we actually go through each element. So, but very high level, these are the different things you need to think about when you're creating your message. So for example, you don't want to go to a legislator with a problem without having a solution. So you go and you tell them, we don't like this, or we need this. Okay, so what is it that you want them to do? I said again, you're not the target audience, right? You have to meet people where they are. So you may want to go in and tell them 400 things, but if they're not there, or they don't even know what you're talking about, or you're just not even the right messenger, you've got to pay attention to where they are. And the other couple things I'll just mention, and again, we can talk about this more in questions and answers, but there's often the best way to engage a policymaker is to both have a story as well as to have data. So some legislators, it's the story that gets them, right? It's about the child who experienced a particular health issue or an education issue or whatever the issue might be. And what you want to be able to do is connect that story to the research. You have the research. We know the information. So some people are driven by data, some are driven by stories. Having an access to both is important. And at the very bottom, and actually you can see it in a couple of places here, we talk about be concise, be jargon-free, be simple and concrete in your language. When we get super passionate about our topics, no matter what the issue is, sometimes we get lost in the weeds and then we lose the very individuals that we're trying to convince. So we've got to make sure that we use language that they can understand. It doesn't mean we can't bring them along and educate them in what we're thinking and the terminology that they should know. But if you're trying to get them to pass a piece of legislation, it may be that you don't tell them every single thing you know. You just tell them the one thing they need to know in order to move things forward. It doesn't always make us feel good as advocates because you want them to do it for the right reasons and to have all the information. Sometimes it just doesn't work out that way. So how do you get started? So first of all, you need to make sure, which I'm sure you do, or of course the partnership does, who are the people you need to be talking to? So you need to know for your own area who represents your community, but then also who's actually on the right committees. So if part of this is about knowing the process and where your bill or where your issue may go through. And I think the thing that many advocates often forget is we focus on the legislature and we forget about the executive branch. The executive branch has a lot of opportunity, a lot of power to do a lot of things, whether it's what they introduce, what they sign, or what they do in rules and regulations. Those rules and regulations can be just as important as the legislation itself. So engaging your executive branch as well as your legislature or at the local level as well, or federal level, is absolutely critical in making sure that you build relationships in each of those areas. And we know that it is very typical that somebody who was in the governor's office moves into the legislature, or the legislature moves into the governor's office, or into into a state agency. And so you should pay attention to all of those spheres because they cannot be understated. So there are a lot of tools at your disposal. And these are a couple of things that you should always consider. So this is the how, and to determine which tool you want to work. So this is largely based on the what you're trying to do and who you're trying to influence. So is there a message that you can create that is super simple? Or in some cases, you do want the more complex message so people can fully understand all the ramifications of the work. It depends on who you are talking to. So you can also see that you have to think about who is best positioned to deliver the message. Sometimes we're just not the right messenger for the person you're trying to convince to do something. And that's ego. We got to take that out of the way. What's going to make the difference? Who is going to actually get that elected official to make a change? Again, on the audience side, what tool do you need to use that they consider important? So you may want to, and it may be appropriate because they use social media. But if they think social media is absolutely evil, that may not be the tool that you're supposed to use. And so it's going to look different depending on your goal, who you're talking to, and how you what you want them to do as a result. Your tool also needs to be determined based on, are they already a little bit more on your side, or are they way, way far away from your position or don't know anything about it? The tool that you use will help you decide which, I'm sorry, where they are will help you decide which tool you should use. So I'm not going to go through this at all, actually, but you'll get the slides after. But these are examples of pros and cons of various tools that you can use when the world is typical. So when we're not in a time of a pandemic, some of these are applicable, some of them are not, but you can use this as a later resource. I do want to highlight a couple of things on this particular slide around the informational lunch. So one of the things that we've learned, both the good and the hard way and the easy way, is that just sitting down with policymakers before you're ever asking them for anything, having lunch with them or a coffee with them or walking the halls with them, it really does make a difference when it's in a casual environment where they don't feel like they're under stress or under pressure. And that's all about spending the time to be able to build those relationships. The other piece is around media, and that is something that we are very predisposed to be doing. So earned media or paid media. So when I talk about earned media, so that's your stories in the paper or online that you got a reporter to write about for you. Paid, of course, would be your advertising. These are things that often are overlooked in our advocacy efforts. We only think about, I have to go meet with a legislator, or I have to do something in social media, or I have to actually do organizing. Truthfully, a comprehensive approach, particularly on issues like vaccines, is probably going to be necessary. You have to use every tool at your disposal in order to combat those who will not be on your side. So we did a little side by side of, or a little slide of, here are all the things that you used to be able to do pre-COVID. And we'll get back to that someday. You want to make sure that you have multiple vehicles, as I mentioned, and you could do all of these things pre-COVID. But we have no idea what's going to happen once your legislature starts. Who knows? So during COVID, in addition to the social media that Jamie talked about, which is just amazing and a great tool, these are some of the things that we've been employing for the last several months. We have been doing more Zoom meetings with legislators, lots with staff, many with committee members, while we are doing regular phone calls with them. The other thing we've been able to do, because it's COVID, is collect all these folks' cell phone numbers So now we're texting them on a regular basis. So before, we may not have had everybody's cell phone numbers, but now because legislators are at home, we're able to text them quite a bit. So it's one of the things to think about is what are the different ways you can communicate with policymakers in this world. So we know Rome wasn't built in a day, and your relationships won't be either. You've got to spend the time, the energy, the resources in order to build those relationships, because relationships are about trust, right? They want to know that they can trust you. You want to know that you can actually reach out to them, and there can be an ongoing back and forth and engagement. So what are just a few quick tips on, and again, I'll say, as my mom said, it's not about, this is about common sense, but it's not always that common. So oops, sorry, one step ahead. So the first thing, policymakers need to know from you. You are the experts. Do not be shy about that at all. Engaging them before you need them, like I said, in that informational lunch or any other method, is a way to be able to build those relationships. You have knowledge that they don't have. And remember, they've got 400 other issues they're working on. So for us to expect that they have the level of detail that we would want them to have, it's just not realistic. And you can't even assume that they have the base knowledge on your priorities. So you've got to make sure that you spend the time at the very beginning to build those relationships and let them see you as the expert. And you can do things like, of course, not in a time of COVID, attending them to having them attend your events. You can regularly share information with them. Make sure that they're in your database, of course, and that you're regularly engaging them. You can send them your newsletters or your annual report. You can do regular emails to them. There's all sorts of ways for you to educate them all along the way, even in a time of COVID. So make sure they see you as that expert. Make sure they see you as that resource. And that is absolutely critical. Our third tip is really around following up. So I can't tell you how many times we've sat in meetings and a legislator says, I want to hear more about it. And then nobody follows up with them. Well, not only have you eroded your trust, you've also not actually taken the opportunity to capitalize on their interest. Even if it wasn't true interest, it was fake interest just to get you out of their office. Whatever it is, you have an opportunity once you've actually engaged a legislator. So follow up always, send it as soon as possible, whatever the it is. And then, and actually, if they give you a specific day, or a time, I need it by 2:00, make sure to get it to them by 2:00. That makes you a more valuable resource. And if you can't do it by a specific time, just let them know. They are human beings. So let them know. I can't get it to you by 2, but I can get it to you by 3, or I can get it to you tomorrow, or it's not me, it's going to be someone else who'll provide that information. Whatever that means for you, that's what you need to do. That follow-up and that trust that you're building with them is absolutely critical. And then tip 4 is treating them like a human. So they put on their pants just like everybody else does. And we have to remember that they are just as tired as we are. They're just as overwhelmed. They're learning things at a breakneck speed. You have to make sure that you get to know them as just who they are. So they have lives, right? They have hobbies. They have favorite sports teams. They may have kids. Find out about them as a person. And you can do that in a couple of different ways. You can find out by just when you're talking to them, ask them about themselves. They love to talk about themselves. So get them talking about themselves and figure out where there's even a potential connection for you. They'll be grateful and they will remember you because you asked them about themselves. Also, because of the internet and social media, you can also get to know them quite a bit online in advance of going in. So if you know that the person that you're going in to talk to has the same favorite sports team that you do, that's a very rudimentary example, but you get the point, then talk about that, loosen them up. We all have to get warmed up, particularly when we don't know anyone. So it really does help with that, particularly when it's a contentious issue, right? So I can agree with you over here, but I don't agree with you over there, but at least we have this area of agreement. And sometimes it's around policy and sometimes it's around a hobby that you have. The other piece of treating them like a human is making sure that you neutralize contentious conversations, in the sense that, I mean, you might be on different sides, but it's never a good idea to get into a yelling argument, screaming argument with an elected official. I see it all the time, but it is not a long-term strategy. I know that I have a temper. I get excited and I don't understand why they're not paying attention. What don't they get? You have to take it down a notch, which is hard to do. It can be. But what we know is that a burned bridge, it's very hard to rebuild that. And if you treat them like a human and say, you know what, I know we don't agree, but let's try to work on this anyway, or I'll come back to you, you might actually still have an open door. So it's important to really think about how you engage with an elected official or a policymaker in the governor's office, wherever they are, and making sure that you understand, even actually, it's an opportunity to understand where they're coming from. So when you're treating them like a human, you can actually hear a little better. What are they saying? What is at the core of why they don't agree with you? What's at the core of what interests them? And then you can use that information later, right? You can use it to find someone else to talk to them or send a different piece of information or to tweak a piece of legislation that you want, because now you understand a little bit more about where they're coming from. And all of that comes from treating them like a human. So very quickly, I'm going to just talk about meetings. And so, of course, we have no idea when the meetings in person will be able to happen. But this is one thing that we are very focused on, because we've seen meetings go poorly very quickly. So so people think, I'm going to make an appointment with the legislator, I'm going to go in and talk to them. Yes, but there's so much more to it. To have an effective meeting, you want to have a variety of tools at your disposal, and you want to do a lot of prep. So we suggest that you never have more than 3 or 4 folks in a meeting at the same time, unless there's some compelling reason to do it. The ideal situation is that each person that comes into that room has a role, they know their role, and that you've practiced that role. So I'm going to do the introductions, that person's going to tell the story, that person's going to bring in the data point, that one's actually from the legislator's home district, so they're going to talk about the high school football team, whatever it is, making sure that everyone has a role, everyone has their talking points, that you know who your primary spokesperson is, so that if things kind of get off course, and sometimes they do, that there's always someone who can bring it right back in. Who's your storyteller? Who's your primary messenger? And it may seem that that is a lot of overkill. We've all done meetings, it's all okay. But I have sat in plenty of meetings where people are talking over each other, that people don't remember to bring up certain issues, that the data that we were all planning on talking about, no one actually thought to bring up. They get excited, they get nervous, the legislator is late. Any number of things can happen that make it a little more awkward. But by practicing both alone, which I do, as well as together with your group, is a great thing. If it can't happen, it's not the end of the world, but at least you would have thought about these things. And this is, again, very basic, but what we try to remind people all the time is there is a way you can have an effective meeting. And so this just lays out, make sure that you mention who you are, tell them your priorities and your need and your request at the very outset, because if they end up only having 5 minutes for you, you may have lost that opportunity to tell them what you're asking for, and then use the rest of the time to back it up with your stories and your data and your history. Be a resource, of course, and always say thank you. But start with telling them what you want and why you're there, and then use the rest of the time to back it up in case your conversation gets cut short. And that happens all the time. So these are just some common meeting challenges, and I won't go through them in detail, but these are things that people ask us all the time. So I'll just take the first one. What if they don't seem interested, or they actually, even the second one, which might be more relevant on the vaccine side, what if they disagree with what we're talking about? So again, it's a never attack. Tell them you understand their concern, even if you don't always understand their concern. Help validate them, and then understand what, again, the core of their concern is. And then you can use that opportunity to come back with research or a story, or help change their priorities, but be prepared. And that research will help you make sure that you know exactly what to do and what to say. Again, I'm not going to go through these in detail at this point, but you do have you'll have these slides. The other couple of things I'll mention before I start to wrap up is around the conducting meetings with staff. A lot of people get really frustrated when they don't get to meet with the elected official with whom they were planning on meeting or whom they were scheduled to talk to. Talking to office staff can be as valuable and sometimes more valuable than talking to the elected official themselves. They are around a long time. They move from office to office. They are the people who, from an office staff, put your message on top versus your message at the bottom. They're the ones who forward the email and say, hey, you need to make time for this person, or they're the ones who don't pay attention. And on the policy side, they have subject matter expertise. So it is not there's no downside in talking to staff. Now, ultimately, of course, you would love to engage with the legislator directly, but I have seen it more times than not, people dismissing talking to a staff member or being upset that they had to talk to a staff member. Talking to a staff member can be super helpful. They're in the meetings that we're not in. They can they take the copious notes. They can help actually push that message along in a caucus meeting, in just whispering in their boss's ears. So it's important to make sure that you don't dismiss talking to staff. Very quickly, the final couple of things. One of the things that I've seen more times than I would like is that people do great follow-up and then they forget to make sure they have the spelling of the elected official's name correctly. They have the wrong bill number in an email. They actually only follow up once. As you see the squeaky wheel here, we say it's that regular engagement. That squeaky wheel does eventually get the oil. It might take some time, but they do in fact get the oil eventually. So just remember to pay attention to these kinds of things. And again, the name and number of legislation, I mean, some of these names and numbers are just so complicated, but getting it right makes a difference, because then it tells the elected official, you are being responsive, you are paying attention to what they're interested in, you are an expert. So think about that. Finally, the practical tips. Hopefully you've gotten a few in this brief presentation, but a few things you could do literally this afternoon. You could find 1 hour per week on your calendar where you engage in advocacy or lobbying. It doesn't have to be all day, every day. That's not your full-time job, but can you find 1 hour a week and just block it on your calendar and say, that's what I'm going to do, something related to advocacy or lobbying? And what could you do with some of that time? You could update your database, right? So we've had an election. Are there new people? We have new stakeholders and new organizations that are cropping up all the time, or that might be interested in the work that you're doing. Spend the time updating your database. Make sure you have the right names and phone numbers and emails, because it's the slow time, so that when you need them, you're not scrambling. Make sure you understand the process. So it might be that you've gotten a million emails that tells you what to look for and where to go and what committees and all the rest. Take this time, take that 1 hour a week to try to figure that out. Maybe your 1 hour a week is you just schedule a meeting, or you schedule 2 meetings. These are things you can do right now to either get to know other advocates, to talk to an elected official before things get really hot and heavy. These are things that you can do right now. So just a few tips to get you started. Thank you.